She didn't scream. She didn't throw things across the marble floor or drag her nails down the gilded walls. That's what they expected. The scorned wife, weeping into silk, begging a faithless king to come back to her bed. But Queen Serafina Valmont had spent 16 years learning that the most dangerous women in any empire are the ones who go very, very quiet. Tonight, while fireworks split the sky above the capital and 10,000 subjects cheered for a crown that sat on her head, she found out. And she went quiet as a blade being drawn slow from its sheath. Stay with me till the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching this unfold. The fireworks had been Adrian's idea. Every year at the Imperial Jubilee, the king commissioned the same spectacle. 1,000 shell volleys launched from the river barges, turning the night sky above Valmont City into something that looked like war had been made beautiful. The crowds packed the boulevard from the palace gates all the way down to the harbor, faces tilted up, mouths open, children sitting on their father's shoulders. It was the one night every year when the empire forgot its grievances and simply looked at the same sky together. Adrian loved that. He loved the unified gaze, the shared awe. It cost him nothing and bought him everything. Serafina had always found it slightly obscene. She stood at the tall window of her private solar on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, watching the bursts of gold and red reflect off the Kessara River far below. She was still in her formal reception gown, deep burgundy silk with the Valmont crest embroidered in silver thread along the collar, though she'd pulled the outer ceremonial robe from her shoulders 2 hours ago and draped it over the back of a chair like it was a horse blanket. Her lady's maid, Dada, had asked 3 times whether she should call for the undressing ladies. 3 times Serafina had said not yet without looking away from the window. She was waiting for something, though she hadn't known what until approximately 40 minutes ago. The answer had arrived in the form of Marette Caldwell, her chief handmaiden, who had entered the solar with the particular walk of a woman carrying information that might get her killed. Marette was 43, had served Serafina since the queen was 19 and still believed in the fundamental decency of powerful men. She had a square, honest face, and she never embellished. When she spoke, it was always the plainest version of whatever truth she was delivering. She'd said, "Your Majesty, there is a woman in the Amber Suite." The Amber Suite was on the 2nd floor of the West Wing. It was the most private guest accommodation in the entire palace. No connecting corridors to servant quarters, its own dedicated staircase, a bathing chamber with imported stone from the southern provinces. It was where the king housed guests he did not want the court to observe arriving or departing. Serafina had kept her eyes on the fireworks. What woman? Marette had held very still. She came with the Renault merchant delegation 2 days ago. She was listed in the party manifest as the wife of a wool factor from Castellan province. Her name on the document reads Ines Renault. A pause. Her actual name is Evelyn Marrow. She is the daughter of Lord Cassin Marrow of the Northern Territories. She has been residing in the king's private hunting lodge outside the capital for the past 4 months. Another volley of shells had gone up outside, rattling the window glass in its frame. 4 months, 4 months, Serafina had repeated, tasting the number. Yes, ma'am. And she is currently in the Amber Suite. Yes, ma'am. She arrived there this evening before the opening ceremony. The king visited the suite for approximately 1 hour before the banquet procession. He has not returned since. Another pause, shorter this time. She has requested the kitchen send up a second supper. She asked that it be the same dishes served at the formal table tonight. Serafina had finally turned from the window. She'd looked at Marette for a long moment, long enough that Marette's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, which was the closest the woman ever came to wincing. Who else knows she's there, Serafina had said. The Amber Suite's dedicated staff, Lord Pell, who manages the West Wing household, probably 3 or 4 of the king's personal guard. Marette had drawn a breath. By morning, every person in this palace will know. That's what she's counting on, Serafina had said very quietly. Not to Marette, more to the particular quality of air in the room. That had been 40 minutes ago. Since then, the 2 women had not spoken. Marette stood near the door with her hands folded in front of her, and her face arranged in perfect professional neutrality, which Serafina recognized as the expression of a person choosing not to offer comfort, because they understood that comfort was not what was needed. What was needed, Serafina was in the process of determining. She pressed 2 fingers to the window glass, feeling the cold through it. Outside, a massive burst of white light erupted over the river, followed by the crowd's collective exhale. That sounded like a wave breaking, 10,000 people breathing out at once. She watched the light fade, leaving trails of smoke that the wind pulled apart against the dark. 16 years. 16 years of standing beside Adrien Laurent at every ceremony, every foreign reception, every military review and harvest festival and court judgment. 16 years of bearing his children, Cassia, who was 14 now, and had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and the two boys who hadn't survived their first winters, whose names she still said in her own head sometimes on bad nights, the way you press a bruise to know it's still there. 16 years of managing the court's factions, while Adrien concerned himself with campaigns and hunting and the company of men who laughed loudly at his jokes. She had never been under any illusion that her marriage was built on devotion. She had understood from the contract signing at 19 that it was a political architecture designed to hold two powerful houses together. She had accepted that. What she had not accepted, and what Evelyn Marrow's presence in the Amber Suite represented, was something else entirely. It was not the infidelity that made her fingers press harder against the glass. Adrien had strayed before, discreetly, briefly, with the particular carelessness of a man who believed his position exempted him from consequence. Serafina had known about those episodes. She had filed them away in the part of herself that she kept locked in private, and she had continued to function, because function was what the Empire required of her. She was not a woman who confused sentiment with strategy, but 4 months at the hunting lodge, a false name on a merchant manifest, the Amber Suite on the night of the Imperial Jubilee, while Serafina stood in the formal procession wearing the Valmont crown, and every noble family in the Empire watched to see whether the Queen's back was still straight. That was not carelessness. That was a declaration. Someone had decided she could be handled, that her dignity was a resource to be spent, that the crown she wore was provisional. She turned from this window. "Maret," she said. "Ma'am, I want every member of the household staff on duty tonight assembled in the lower servants' hall within the hour. Not the kitchen staff. I don't need cooks. I need eyes. Every footman, every door attendant, every corridor warden who has worked in this palace for more than 5 years." She moved to her writing table, opening the locked drawer with the small key she wore on a chain beneath her gown. "I also want Captain Reese brought to me. Not sent a message, brought here, personally, by you. The captain of the Queen's Guard." Mara said it carefully, making sure. "He is the captain of the Palace Guard and has been for 11 years. Tonight he is going to remember which title came first." She pulled a sheet of palace stationery from the drawer and uncapped her pen. "And I want the court recorder, Theodan Moss. He is to bring the official ledger for proceedings of state and his seal." Maret was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "You're going to make it a matter of record. Everything that happens in this palace tonight will be a matter of record." Serafina began writing, her hand moving steadily across the paper. "That's not a choice I'm making. That's already the situation. The only question is who controls the record." She heard Maret's footsteps cross to the door, heard the soft click of the latch, and then she was alone in the solar with the sound of distant fireworks and the scratch of her own pen. She wrote for several minutes. When she finished, she read back what she'd written once, made one small correction, crossed out a word and replaced it with a sharper one, and set the pen down. She sat with her hands flat on the table, not moving, looking at the wall opposite where a portrait of Adrien's father hung in a heavy gilt frame. The old king had been a brutal man, her father-in-law, the kind of ruler who solved problems by removing the people who had them. Not subtle, but effective, in the way that a war hammer is effective. Adrien had inherited his father's confidence and his father's carelessness, and none of his father's clarity about what power actually cost. That was the difference, Serafina thought, between a man who had fought for a crown and a man who had been handed one. She rose, straightened her gown, and went to look at herself in the long glass near the armoire. What she saw was a woman of 35 with high cheekbones and dark circles under gray eyes, and a jawline that had always been too sharp to be conventionally beautiful. Her hair was still up in the formal arrangement from the evening ceremony, though several strands had come loose at the temples. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had absorbed a piece of information that weighed a great deal and was deciding where to set it down. She did not look like a woman who was going to cry. That was the thing about her that people had always misread, even people who'd known her for years. They saw her control, and they called it coldness. They saw her precision, and they called it calculation. What they never seemed to understand was that the control was not a mask over some softer interior. It was the interior. Serafina Valmont was not a woman suppressing feelings she was ashamed of. She was a woman for whom action was the feeling, for whom the clear-eyed identification of a problem and the construction of its solution was the most natural expression of whatever lived inside her. She was not furious in the way that made you shake. She was furious in the way that made you think. She reached up and pulled 2 loose pins from her hair, allowing those escaped strands to settle. Then she left them. She wanted to look slightly undone tonight. She wanted the people in this palace to understand that they had reached her, that she was a human being who had been genuinely wounded, and that she had decided to act anyway. Invincibility was a performance for people who were afraid. She had nothing left to be afraid of. She walked out of the solar and into the corridor. The midnight banquet had been Serafina's official design, though she delegated the execution to Lord Aldrich's event staff, which meant the table arrangements were slightly too formal and the floral centerpieces were the same as last year. She'd noticed both things when she entered the grand hall at 9 and made a mental note to address them with Aldrich in the morning. Even on the worst nights, the craft had to be maintained. The grand hall could seat 300. Tonight it held approximately 260, the inner nobility, the senior ministers, the foreign delegations that mattered enough to be included in the intimate celebration rather than the public boulevard festivities. The room blazed with chandelier light and the smell of 50 courses moving through service stations along both walls. Music came from the gallery above, a quintet playing something that was meant to be festive and managed merely to be loud. Serafina took her seat at the head of the main table, to the left of the empty chair that was Adrian's. The king had not yet arrived. She accepted a glass of wine from a footman, set it down without drinking, and surveyed the room with the particular systematic thoroughness that she applied to everything. Not anxiously, not theatrically, just comprehensively. She wanted to know who was watching her. She wanted to know who already knew. The answers were most of the room and almost everyone. She could read it in the quality of attention being paid to her. It was too focused, too careful, the way people look at something they expect to either break or explode. Several of the older noble wives were watching her with an expression she recognized as compassionate dread, the look of women who had survived their own versions of this night and were performing a silent accounting of what it had cost them. Lord Cassine Aurel of the Western Provinces was having what appeared to be an animated conversation with the Threnish ambassador, but kept cutting his eyes toward the main entrance, waiting for something. The younger courtiers, the ones whose social position depended entirely on their ability to identify and attach themselves to power, were doing the particular dance of people trying to determine which way the ground was about to move. They all knew, or they knew enough. The Amber Suite had done exactly what Evelyn Marrow had intended it to do. Serafina picked up her wine and drank a small, deliberate sip. Around her, the nearest guests seemed to collectively release a breath they'd been holding, and the conversational noise of the room rose by a perceptible degree. She had given them permission, with that single ordinary gesture, to pretend for a moment longer that the evening was merely an evening. She was not inclined to indulge them for very long. Adrian arrived 20 minutes late, which was within his normal parameters for the Jubilee banquet. He always left the formalities to accumulate, believing his entrance should feel like an event in itself. He came through the main doors with his personal advisor, Lord Haywell, and 3 members of his guard, already laughing at something Haywell had said, that particular loose-shouldered laugh he produced when he wanted a room to feel that he was comfortable, and therefore they should be. He was wearing his formal military coat, dark blue with the Laurent gold at the collar, and he looked, this was the honest truth of it, and Serafina had always been honest with herself, like a king. He had the size for it, and the face for it, and the particular way of moving through a room that made walls seem to rearrange themselves around him. It was also, she had determined in the last 40 minutes, either profoundly stupid or had made the calculation that she would absorb this without reacting, which meant he thought she could be managed. She watched him cross the hall, stopping to exchange words at 2 tables before reaching the head of the room. He bent to press a brief kiss to her temple, the marital shorthand of public function, performed with the automation of long habit, and settled into his chair. "I'm late," he said, picking up his menu card. "You are," she agreed. "Haywell kept me. Something about the Castellan delegation's river access complaints." He set the card down, flagged a footman for wine. "Did the fireworks read well from the east wing? I thought the 3rd act dragged." The third act is always the same, she said. I keep telling them to cut the white sequence. It's redundant after the gold. He received his wine, took a proper drink, and turned to his left to address some minor lord whose name Seraphina could not at this moment be bothered to recall. She watched the side of her husband's face for several seconds, the easy angle of his jaw, the complete absence in his posture of anything resembling awareness that the room was watching them like a landscape watching a sky that has gone the wrong color. He genuinely believed, she realized, that he had managed this correctly, that whatever he'd arranged with Haywell or whoever else formed the scaffolding of this deception, it was sufficient, that she either didn't know or wouldn't act. A waiter set a bowl of consommé in front of her. She looked at it. Across the table and 2 seats down, Lord Orrell had stopped his conversation with the Threnish ambassador entirely, and was looking at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and landing somewhere closer to fearful. Orrell was 61, had served on the Royal Council for 20 years, and was one of the 2 or 3 people in this room who understood what she was actually capable of when she decided the situation required it. They had crossed swords, the formal parliamentary kind, 3 times in council chambers, and twice she had won not by having more support, but by being willing to go further than he'd anticipated. I was afraid of what she was going to do tonight. That was useful to know. She picked up her spoon and began eating her consommé, and had consumed approximately half of it when she became aware of a particular quality of stillness spreading from the far end of the hall. Not silence. The music was still playing, individual conversations were still audible, but a kind of held-breath arrest that moved through a crowd the way cold air moves through a room when a window is opened in winter. Spreading from the secondary entrance on the north wall. She did not turn immediately. She finished the spoonful she was on, set her spoon down on the correct side of the bowl, and then turned her head. Evelyn Marrow had entered the banquet. She was younger than Seraphina had expected, though she shouldn't have been surprised. Adrian had always been drawn to youth the way certain men were drawn to things they feared losing, coveting them in others. Evelyn Marrow was perhaps 26, with the particular beauty that came from a combination of excellent bones and the confidence of a woman who had been told since childhood that her face was a form of power. She was tall. She wore a gown of deep amber silk. The coincidence of the color hit Seraphina somewhere below the sternum and stayed there, burning quietly, with her dark hair dressed in a style that was formal enough for the occasion and fashionable enough to be noticed. She moved into the room with the studied ease of someone who had rehearsed this entrance, and the ease was almost convincing. Almost. Because the eyes gave her away. She was scanning the room too fast, touching too many faces with her gaze, and when those eyes landed on Seraphina, which they did within the first 4 seconds, because Evelyn Marrow had very good instincts about where power was located, there was a half second of something that was not confidence, something that might have been the beginning of doubt. Then she smiled, and the smile was extraordinary, warm, direct, exactly calibrated to communicate, I am meant to be here and I know you know it. Seraphina held her gaze for 3 full seconds, expressionless, and then returned to her consommé. The room exhaled again. Conversations resumed, louder now, a defensive noise. Someone laughed too hard at something near the east wall. Seraphina heard Adrian go very still beside her. You should have told her to stay in the suite, Seraphina said, addressing her soup. Adrian said nothing. It might have contained this. She set the spoon down. For another day or 2. Perhaps long enough to move her back to Castellan without a full scene. She picked up her wine, met the eyes of Lord Orrell across the table. He looked away immediately, and turned to look at her husband for the first time since his arrival. Adrian was holding his wine glass in a way that suggested his hand had tightened around it. His face had arranged itself into something intended to project calm, and was producing, to her eye, mostly the effort of attempting calm. He did not look at her. Seraphina, he said, very low. Don't, she said, just as low, and with a precision in the single syllable that made him close his mouth. She turned back to face forward. Across the hall, Evelyn Marrow had been guided to a seat at one of the secondary tables. By whom, Seraphina would need to determine, since the seating arrangements had not included this guest. Someone had placed her at the table occupied by the younger minor lords and their wives, the table where the social current was fastest and the gossip sharpest, and the seating of a beautiful unknown woman would generate the maximum amount of conversation. Serafina watched Evelyn accept her seat, watched the people at that table recalibrate their own positions relative to this arrival, and thought, she is very good at this. She has been planning this night for a long time. The first course was cleared. The second arrived. Adrian, beside her, made several attempts to engage in conversation with the guests on his left, and his voice had recovered some of its usual ease, but not all of it. The room continued to perform a celebration it no longer felt. The music from the gallery had shifted to something slower. It was during the fourth course, a roasted game bird that Serafina did not touch, that Evelyn Marrow decided to announce herself. She rose from her chair at the secondary table with the easy authority of a woman who had decided the current arrangement of the room did not adequately serve her, and she crossed the floor toward the main table. She moved unhurriedly, acknowledging with brief nods the stares directed at her. And there were many, because the room had been waiting for exactly this movement since her entrance, and now that it was happening, the conversations collapsed into a spreading hush that preceded her like a bow wave. She stopped 6 feet from the head of the main table. From that position, she could address both the king and queen simultaneously. It was a calculated distance, close enough for intimacy, far enough to be performing for an audience. "Your Grace," she said to Adrian, and her voice was clear and warm and carried through the quiet room with no apparent effort. "I am sorry to interrupt your celebration. I wanted to offer my compliments on the evening. The fireworks were remarkable." And then, turning those eyes to Serafina, with the smile still perfectly in place, "and to offer my respects to Her Majesty, of course." The "of course" landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. There was a particular kind of contempt that dressed itself in courtesy. Serafina had encountered it many times in 20 years of royal courts. The compliment that was actually a diminishment, the deferential phrase that carried within it the absolute certainty that the person being deferred to was already irrelevant. You had to be very skilled at it, or it read immediately as aggression. Evelyn Marrow was skilled at it. In other circumstances, in a different life, Serafina might have admired the precision. The room did not move. Serafina set down her fork. She touched the edge of her napkin. She looked at Evelyn Marrow, at the amber dress, at the careful smile, at the eyes that were very nearly succeeding at concealing the ferocity underneath, and she took one breath. "What is your name?" she said conversationally, as though she genuinely did not know. A flicker. Brief. "Evelyn Marrow, Your Majesty, of the Northern Marrow." Serafina said it the way you might examine an object handed to you whose purpose you haven't determined yet. "Lord Cassin Marrow's house." She turned to Adrian, who had gone the color of marble. "Did you present this guest to the court, Adrian?" "Serafina." He started to rise. "I asked a question," she said, still conversational, which somehow stopped him more effectively than volume would have. "It's a simple one. Did you, as king, present this woman to the court through the appropriate channels, with the appropriate review and documentation, as is required by the Charter of 1187 for any individual granted access to a state celebration?" She paused. "Or did she arrive on a merchant manifest under a false name and walk into this hall on her own initiative tonight?" The room was perfectly silent now. Even the musicians in the gallery had stopped, which meant someone up there was paying more attention to the floor than to their music. Evelyn Marrow's smile had not disappeared, but it had thinned to something that was more structural than genuine, a shape maintained by effort rather than feeling. Her eyes had gone very still. "You overestimate the formality required," she began. "I was not speaking to you," Serafina said, and the quiet delivery of it hit harder than shouting would have. Evelyn stopped. Serafina rose from her chair. Not hastily. There was nothing hasty about her, ever, but with the full, deliberate ceremony of a woman who understood that the act of standing in this room, at this table, was a political statement that would be interpreted and recorded and repeated. She was 5'7", and the heels of her formal shoes added 2 inches, and the Valmont crown in her hair, which she was still wearing because she hadn't taken it off since the ceremony, because she had known 3 hours ago that she might need it tonight, added the particular gravity of a symbol that people had been trained since birth to recognize. "Captain Reese," she said, not raising her voice, simply directing it toward the doors where her guard captain had positioned himself exactly where she'd asked him to be 90 minutes ago, when she'd met with him in the solar and explained in direct, complete terms what the evening might require of him. Reese was a soldier first, which was why she trusted him. 40 years old, a decade and a half in palace service, not a man who confused loyalty with obedience. He stepped forward from his position at the door with two of his detail flanking him. "Your Majesty," he said. Serafina addressed the room. All of it, with the unhurried directness of someone who had stood in this hall hundreds of times and would stand in it hundreds of times more. "This celebration will pause for 1 hour. Guests are welcome to remain at their tables or withdraw to the garden corridor." She let her eyes move across the room, not nervously, just completely, the way a person reads a document, and ended on Evelyn Marrow. "Miss Marrow will accompany the captain." "You cannot," Adrian started, and his voice had the roughness of a man whose authority was slipping through his hands faster than he'd anticipated. "I am the queen," Serafina said simply. "I can." The doors to the outer colonnade were opened. Beyond them, the storm that had been building all evening, the meteorological one, the one that had been visible on the horizon since late afternoon, that the court weathermen had noted and the event staff had privately worried about, and that Serafina had watched gathering from her solar window while she wrote her instructions to Reese, had arrived fully. Rain drove sideways through the opening in sheets, and the sound of it swallowed the last of the room's music, and a lance of lightning articulated itself somewhere above the river, and threw the colonnade into white light for a single crackling second. Evelyn Marrow looked at the open doors. She looked at the rain. She looked at Captain Reese, who was standing with his hands at his sides with the particular quality of stillness that military training produces. Not threatening, simply indicating that all available options had already been considered and the outcome was not variable. She turned to Adrian with an expression that was asking him to do the thing she'd spent 4 months training him to do, which was to choose her over the consequence. Adrian Laurent looked at his wife, and something in his face, some specific interior architecture, shifted. Serafina saw it happen. She'd known it might, had not planned around it either way, because she was not the kind of person who made plans that depended on other people's choices. But she watched it happen. Adrian looking at the woman in the amber dress, and then looking at his queen, and finally, perhaps for the first time in 4 months or 4 years or 16 years, actually looking at her, at the steadiness and the fury and the crown and the woman underneath all of it who had been holding his empire together with both hands while he'd been at the hunting lodge. And something broke open in his face that might have been recognition. He said nothing. He made no move to intervene. Evelyn Marrow understood what his silence meant. Serafina watched her understand it, watched the calculation strip away, and the real face arrive, younger than the performance, and angrier, and more desperate, and more dangerous. She walked toward the colonnade doors with Captain Reese beside her. The rain screamed beyond the opening. She stopped at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, and turned back to the room with a smile that was nothing like the one she'd entered with. This one was honest. It was the smile of a woman who has decided she has nothing left to manage. "You think this ends here," she said to Serafina. "You think I'm the problem." She looked at Adrian, and there was something in the look that wasn't desperation anymore. It was something older and colder and more purposeful. "Ask your husband what he signed, Your Majesty. Ask him what he promised. Then tell me who the problem is." Reese put his hand, lightly but firmly, on her arm. She went through the door into the rain. The storm took her. The room remained in its arrested silence for 3 full seconds. Then Serafina sat back down, placed her napkin across her lap, and picked up her fork. "The musicians may continue," she said. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the rain hammering the colonnade glass, and from somewhere in the upper gallery, the tentative, uncertain recommencement of a single-stringed instrument, as though the musician wasn't entirely sure whether civilization was still the agreed-upon arrangement. Adrian's chair scraped. He rose. He did not look at her. "Adrian," she said, the same tone she'd used all evening. Quiet, complete, a door that was closed all the way. "If you go to her right now, I will have the court recorder declare this evening's proceedings at the morning session. Every detail, presented to the full council." He stopped walking. His back was to her. "What did she sign?" Serafina said, and her voice did something it hadn't done all evening. It dropped to a register that was no longer about the room, no longer a performance, no longer anything except a woman asking her husband to account for himself. "Adrian, what did you sign?" He stood there with the rain tearing at the colonnade doors and 260 people not breathing. And outside, in the cold dark of the storm, something happened. A sound that cut through the rain. A woman's voice lifted in what might have been a cry of fury or triumph or both. carrying words that the marble walls of the colonnade fractured into syllables that Serafina couldn't quite parse, couldn't quite assemble into meaning. But Marette, standing near the north wall, had gone the color of chalk, and Captain Reese was pushing back through the colonnade doors with rain streaming from his coat and an expression on his face that Serafina had never seen on him in 11 years of service, an expression she had no immediate framework for, because it was not alarm and it was not the neutral professional readiness she associated with his normal function. It was something closer to dread. "Your Majesty," he said, and his voice had changed too, had lost the formal finish, had become the voice of a soldier in the field. "You need to hear what she's saying." Reese's coat was soaked through to the wool beneath the leather, and the water running off him made a small dark pool on the marble floor as he stood there. And Serafina registered all of this with the part of her mind that never fully stopped cataloging, the part that had kept her alive and functional through 16 years of a court that rewarded attention and punished everything else. "Say it plainly," she said. Reese looked at the room, 260 people looking back at him. He made the calculation in about 2 seconds. She watched him make it, and moved 3 steps closer to her chair, dropping his voice to the range that would carry to her and Adrian and no further. "She's saying the king signed a betrothal amendment," he said, "a secondary contract. She's saying it was witnessed and sealed." The room could not hear the words, but it could read the architecture of the moment. A soldier with rain on his coat speaking close to the queen's ear while the king stood frozen near the colonnade doors. And the particular silence that followed was the silence of an audience that understands it is watching something that cannot be untold. Serafina did not look at Adrian. She held Reese's eyes. "Does she have documentation?" "She says it's held in trust outside the capital." He paused. "She says the name of the trust holder is Lord Pell." Lord Pell, who managed the West Wing household, who had arranged the Amber Suite, who had been in this palace for 9 years and had served, until this moment, as a man Serafina had considered minor enough to be harmless. She turned her head and looked at Adrian. I was still standing near the doors. His face had done something she'd never seen it do in 16 years, which was to lose all its architecture at once. Not just the performance of calm, but the underlying confidence that had always been there, the bedrock assumption that the world was arranged in his favor. He looked stripped. He looked like a man who had made what he believed was a private arrangement and was discovering that privacy had never been part of the other party's plan. "Adrian," she said. He turned to face her. "Is it real?" she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. The rain drove hard against the colonnade glass behind him, a sustained assault that the building absorbed without comment, the way old stone absorbs everything. "It was supposed to be." He stopped, started again. "It was a contingency, a private instrument. It was never intended to—" "Is it legally binding?" she said. The silence that followed that question was its own answer. It was a silence with weight and dimension. It was the silence of a man who had told himself a story about what he was doing and was now, in this hall, in front of his court and his queen, and the record that Theodan Moss was making in the official ledger at the far end of the room. She'd positioned Moss there specifically, within earshot of the main table, watching the story collapse into its actual components. "It requires counter-signature," Adrian said finally. "The council. It requires ratification. It was never—" He ran a hand across his jaw. "I never intended to use it." "But you signed it." He didn't answer, which was the answer. Serafina stood up for the second time that evening. This time, the movement felt different to her. Not the deliberate performance of earlier, but something more interior, more animal. The thing that lives below strategy. She'd spent the past hour operating at the level of chess, moving pieces with complete awareness of the board. What was moving through her now was older than chess. She had given him 16 years. She had built the administrative architecture of this kingdom while he sat the throne. She had buried 2 sons and kept her face arranged correctly at both funerals because the court needed to see a queen and not a mother. And she had decided without anyone asking her that the empire required the queen more than she required to be seen in her grief. She had absorbed every quiet indignity and every loudly ignored slight, and every room that went quiet when she entered because they'd been discussing something her husband had done and they were deciding whether to tell her. She had absorbed it and filed it and kept functioning because function was what she had. It was her instrument, her weapon, the specific gift she'd been given and developed and sharpened, and she had never once allowed it to slip. He had signed a document designed to replace her. Not to take a mistress, not to have an arrangement that both parties maintained the decency to keep private. He had taken a 26-year-old woman and made her a legal contingency. He had put her on paper. He had given her a mechanism. Serafina breathed out through her nose. One breath, steady. Theodan, she said, not loudly. Moss looked up from the far end of the room with the careful expression of a man who understood that what he wrote tonight would still be read 200 years from now. Note that the king has confirmed the existence of a private instrument affecting the succession and marital arrangements of the crown, executed without council knowledge or ratification, held in trust by a named palace official. She paused. Note the date, the hour, and the names of all senior nobles present. Serafina. Adrian's voice had changed. The stripped quality was gone, replaced by something harder. The particular register of a man who has been cornered and is deciding whether the corner is actually a corner. You are turning a private matter into a state crisis. You turned a private matter into a state crisis when you signed a document in secret and installed its architect in my palace, she said. I'm simply making the record accurate. I am the king. You are, she agreed, and I am the queen. And for the past 4 months, one of us has been administering this empire while the other was at the hunting lodge. And I think everyone in this room is capable of determining which of us was where. She looked at the assembly, all of it, all at once, the way she'd been doing all her life, reading the room like terrain. The council will convene at dawn. Every member, no proxy representation. She looked at Lord Orrell, who was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. Lord Orrell, you will be present. Your Majesty, he said, barely audible. Lord Pell will be taken into custody tonight. She looked at Rhys. By you personally. Not by the King's Guard. By mine. Rhys nodded once. And Miss Marrow. Serafina picked up her wine glass, looked into it, set it back down. Is she still outside? Yes, ma'am. Bring her inside. She felt the room flinch. She did not soften what came next. She's going to finish what she started. She came here to say something in front of this court, and I want it said properly. In here, on dry ground. In front of every witness Theodan Moss can fit in his ledger. She looked at Adrian one more time. Because whatever she knows, we are going to know it tonight. All of it. In this hall. On the record. Adrian said, You are making an enemy of me. She met his eyes. Adrian, you were never my enemy. You were my husband, which is a far more complicated thing. She tilted her head slightly. But if you choose to become my enemy in the next 60 seconds by walking through those doors, I want you to understand something very clearly. I have been running this empire from the position of queen, which means I have done everything you've been unwilling to do. The administration, the appointments, the trade negotiations with Thren, the suppression of the Callaway uprisings that your advisors told you resolved themselves. I know where everybody is buried, Adrian, figuratively and in some cases not figuratively. He stared at her. I have been patient, she said, because the empire needed patience. That is finished now. She paused. Walk through those doors if you choose, but know that by morning, every document I have signed, administered, and executed in this palace over 16 years will be accurately attributed, and we will discover together what your reign looks like without the work I have been doing inside it. The quintet in the gallery had stopped entirely. The only sound in the room was rain and the scratch of Theodan Moss's pen, and somewhere in the colonnade, water moving through a drainage channel in the stone. Adrian did not walk through the doors. He stood there for a long moment with the rain at his back and the room in front of him and something working through him that she could not name but could see. A physical process. The way you can see a man absorb a blow even after the impact is finished, the body still processing what happened to it. Then he turned and walked back to his chair and sat down. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. The colonnade doors opened and Captain Rhys brought Evelyn Marrow back inside. She was soaked. The amber dress was plastered to her, and her hair had come entirely down, and there was a streak of something, rain-diluted cosmetic maybe, or just the rawness of cold skin, along one cheekbone. She walked without being dragged, and she kept her chin at the same angle she'd had it when she first walked into the hall, which Serafina registered and respected in a cold, functional way, the way you respect a weapon that has been well made even when it's pointed at you. Evelyn looked at the room, at the faces, at Adrian, sitting at the head table with his eyes on the tablecloth, at Serafina, standing. You wanted me to speak, Evelyn said. Her voice had lost the social polish. What was underneath it was sharper and less managed and more real. In front of everyone. Say what you came here to say, Serafina said. All of it. You think I'm afraid of this room. I think you planned this room, Serafina said. I think you have been planning this particular moment for considerably longer than 4 months. And I think you are intelligent enough to have understood, when you walked into that storm, that the plan was unraveling, and I think you have already decided what to do next. She held the other woman's gaze. So do it. Say the rest of it. Whatever you told Reese outside might say it here, to me, on the record, where it cannot be privately arranged or quietly suppressed by anyone in this palace. Something moved through Evelyn Marrow's face. Not the performance, not the calculation, something that lived below both of those things. Something that had been there since she was a northern lord's daughter, watching women with crowns on their heads and measuring the distance. You want the truth, Evelyn said. I want it on the record, Serafina said, which may or may not be the same thing. Evelyn looked at Adrian. Something between them. Some specific charge. Some history that Serafina was not part of, moved and then resolved into nothing. Adrian did not look up. Evelyn looked back at Serafina, and she began to talk. She talked for 11 minutes by the clock on the south wall, and Theodan Moss's pen did not stop moving, and the room did not move, and the rain did not stop. And by the time she finished, the hall was as silent as a held breath at the bottom of a very deep well. She described the forged letters, 3 of them, written in Serafina's hand by a copyist Evelyn had sourced through a merchant contact in the Eastern District. Letters designed to implicate the Queen in a scheme to redirect imperial treasury funds to a private account held under a name that could be traced, with enough digging, back to Serafina's family house. The letters had not been sent yet. They were, Evelyn said, the contingency for the contingency. In the event that the betrothal amendment was challenged, in the event that the council resisted, in the event that the Queen did not simply accept the new arrangement and recede into the dignified secondary position that powerful men have always designed for women they are finished using. She described the 3 royal advisors she had bribed, their names delivered in the flat tone of a woman who has decided that if she is going down, she is not going down alone, for information, for access, for the small procedural alterations to official documents that, accumulated over months, had made certain administrative decisions look like Serafina's failures rather than outcomes of policies she'd never been consulted on. She described the coronation plan. She said the word poison, the way you say a word you have been carrying so long it has lost its weight, and the room that had been silent went into a different kind of silence. The kind that is not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else, something cold and specific, and without any mercy in it. Serafina did not move. She was aware of Adrian rising from his chair somewhere to her left, aware of the physical sound of Reese's hand moving to his weapon, aware of Lord Oral making some involuntary noise that might have been a word, aware of all of it the way you are aware of everything in the periphery when the center of your vision has gone absolutely still. The coronation, Serafina said. The anniversary ceremony. Next month. The wine service, Evelyn said. The Queen's personal cup. The serving staff for that table was already arranged. Was, Serafina said. I have no reason to protect it now, Evelyn said. Her voice had gone flat and very quiet. I came here with a plan, and the plan required him to hold. Her eyes moved briefly to Adrian, where he stood rigid with one hand on the back of his chair. He didn't hold. The room understood what this meant. Serafina watched it move through the assembly like weather moving through a valley, the faces changing as the full geometry of what had been described became clear. Not just an infidelity, not just a private document, but a systematic architecture of replacement, and at its end, removal. Serafina turned to Theodan Moss. Is it recorded? Every word, Your Majesty, Moss said. His voice was the voice of a man who will be telling this story for the rest of his life and knows it. Serafina looked at Reese. He was already looking at her, already reading her face for the instruction, and she gave it with the smallest movement of her chin toward the doors to the holding corridor. Not the storm, not the public colonnade, but the interior passage that led to the palace's administrative cells. The rooms that existed for exactly this purpose, where men and women who had done things requiring formal accounting waited for the council to convene. Reese moved toward Evelyn Marrow. Evelyn did not retreat. She watched him come. And then, with Reese 2 steps away, and the room's attention entirely on the transfer of custody that was about to formally end one chapter of this night, her hand moved. It moved from the fold of her soaked dress where it had been resting at her side, and what it produced was a blade, small, the length of 2 fingers, the kind of thing a woman might carry, because the world she moved through had taught her that the distance between a plan succeeding and a plan failing was sometimes the length of a decision made in the space of a breath. And when a plan failed, you were alone. And when you were alone, you survived however you could. Serafina saw it. Rhys saw it at the same moment, and his body was already in motion, already committing to the interception. But he was 2 steps away, and the blade was aimed at a point above Serafina's collarbone. And in the fractional second in which the geometry resolved itself, what happened was this. Adrien Laurent, king of the Valmont Empire, the man who had signed a document in secret and spent 4 months at the hunting lodge and stood at the colonnade door, deciding whether to choose the woman who was trying to kill his queen, moved. He moved faster than Serafina had ever seen him move in 16 years of standing beside him. He came around the chair and put himself between her and the blade and took what had been intended for her throat into his left shoulder, just below the joint, and the sound it made was very small, which was somehow worse than if it had been larger. The room exploded. Rhys had Evelyn's wrist before the second had passed. The blade was on the floor. Evelyn was against the wall with Rhys's forearm across her chest and 2 additional guards on her arms, and she was not struggling, and her face had gone past expression into something that was just the aftermath of a decision that had used up everything. Adrien was still standing. I was holding his shoulder with his right hand, and the blood was coming through his fingers in the particular dark color that firelight makes of it, and he was looking at Serafina with his face completely open. No architecture, no performance, just the face of a man who had done a thing and did not yet know what it cost him or what it bought him, who was simply present in the moment after. Serafina looked at him for 1 second. 2. The room was chaos at the edges. Voices, movement, someone calling for the palace physician, Moss still writing because Moss would always still be writing. And in the center of it, she and Adrien were as still as the eye of everything, looking at each other across a distance of 4 feet and 16 years. She stepped to him. She put her hand over his on the wound, pressing, which was the practical thing, and the only thing she was willing to do right now, the only gesture available to her that was not irrevocable. "Don't let go," she said. He covered her hand with his blood-wet palm. The physician was already pushing through the crowd. Rhys was issuing instructions to his detail in the clipped shorthand of a man managing 4 situations simultaneously. Moss was writing. Lord Orrel had put his face in his hands, and in the corner of her vision, as the physician reached them and began the work of assessing what the blade had done, Serafina saw Evelyn Marrow, held between 2 guards, wrists pinned, dress soaked and ruined, the plan finished. And she saw on that face, beneath everything else, the thing she hadn't expected. Not defeat. Something older. Something that was almost, in its absolute stripped-down honesty, a kind of recognition. One woman looking at another across the wreckage of a night that had changed the shape of the empire. Fina held her gaze for a single breath. Then she looked back at the physician and said, "How bad?" "Deep," he said. "Not the artery. He'll keep the arm." She nodded, filed it, breathed. Tomorrow. There would be a council session and formal charges and the names of 3 corrupt advisors and the recovery of forged letters and the beginning of the long administrative work of dismantling what had been built against her. Tomorrow, there would be the question of what to do with a king who had nearly destroyed everything, and then, at the last possible second, stepped in front of a blade. Tonight there was this, her hand under his, pressing against the wound, keeping the blood in. Outside, the storm was still going. But somewhere above the river, in the direction she couldn't see from where she stood, a single break in the cloud cover had opened. She couldn't see it, but she would know it was there later when Marid described it, the way the light had come through just for a moment over the water while the palace hall burned with firelight and consequence, and the beginning of something that had not yet been named. The physician said, "I need to move him." Serafina said, "I know." She did not let go of his hand until she had to. The physician's name was Corin, and he had been the palace's senior medical officer for 14 years. And in those 14 years he had learned that the thing you said after you finished working on a king was almost as important as the work itself, because the people in the room were making decisions based on your face before you opened your mouth. He came out of the private antechamber off the Grand Hall's north corridor at approximately 2 in the morning and found Serafina standing against the opposite wall with her arms at her sides, and Maret 6 feet away doing the thing she always did, which was to exist in a state of perfect readiness that looked, to anyone who didn't know her, like stillness. Corin said, "The blade caught the anterior deltoid. Clean entry, reasonable depth. I've packed and sutured. He'll have pain for 3 weeks and limited rotation for 6, and he needs to keep the arm immobile or he'll tear the repair." He paused. "He's asking for you." "In a moment," Serafina said. Corin nodded and moved away down the corridor. He had learned in 14 years not to press her. Serafina stayed against the wall. She was looking at the floor 6 feet in front of her, not blankly, not vacantly, but with the focused inward quality of someone running calculations that required the exterior world to hold still for a moment. Marit did not speak. The corridor was lit by wall sconces that were burning low at this hour, casting the stone in amber, and somewhere at the far end the sound of the palace's nighttime maintenance, the floor staff, the corridor wardens, the machinery of a building that never entirely slept, moved like low tide. Serafina was thinking about the 3 advisors. Eveline had named them. Moss had recorded the names. They were Lord Vance Adderley, Senior Minister of the Interior, Lord Crendab, Chair of the Trade Commission, and a man named Solon Prigg, who held the administrative title of Deputy Royal Secretary and whose actual function, as Serafina had understood for approximately 4 years, was to be the institutional memory of the palace's bureaucratic machinery, the man who knew where the paperwork was, who had signed what, which decisions had been recorded accurately and which had been recorded in the version that served someone's purpose. She had known Prigg for 9 years. She had worked directly with him on 6 major administrative projects. She had trusted him with the kind of operational access that you gave only to people you'd had time to evaluate, people who had demonstrated, over years of proximity and pressure, that they were the furniture of the institution rather than actors within it. She thought about the specific texture of that trust now, what it had felt like from the inside. How indistinguishable it was, she realized, from the texture of a well-constructed false surface. You pressed on it, and it held. You leaned on it, and it held. You built things on top of it, and they stood. And then one night in a storm, a woman in a ruined amber dress said a name in front of a room full of witnesses, and the surface held for 1 more second before it didn't. That was the nature of betrayal from inside the architecture. It didn't announce itself as instability. It announced itself as catastrophe, usually at the moment when you had the least capacity to absorb the information. She pushed off the wall. "I want Prigg brought to the small council chamber," she told Mara. "Tonight. Not morning. Now." She started toward the antechamber door. "And I want Reese in the room when I speak to him. Reese is still processing Miss Marrow's formal detention. When he's finished—" She stopped with her hand on the door. "Maret, the letters. The forged ones." She turned her head slightly without fully turning around. Where would Prigg have stored the physical copies? If he was the mechanism Eveline used to move documents through the palace. Maret was quiet for 4 seconds. This was not uncertainty. Maret's silences were never uncertainty. They were the space she required to be precise. His administrative office has a secondary document vault. It's registered as overflow storage for the Trade Commission archives. It's one of 7 such vaults in the East Administrative Wing. A pause. "It has its own lock, separate from the master key system. Send someone to secure it before he's brought in," Serafina said. "Not to enter it, just to make sure no one else does." "Yes, ma'am." She opened the door and went in. Adrian was propped against the head of the narrow recovery cot that Corin kept in the antechamber, his left shoulder wrapped in clean linen that was already showing a faint rust stain at the center. He had been given something for the pain. She could see it in the slight softness around his eyes. But he was awake and tracking. The fireplace in the corner was going. On the small table beside the cot there was a cup of water that hadn't been touched. He looked at her when she entered. She pulled the chair from the writing desk, turned it, and sat in front of him. Close enough that a conversation didn't require volume. Far enough that it remained a conversation. "How bad is it, actually?" he said. "Corin told you." "Corin told me the medical version." His voice was low, abraded at the edges by the medication and the hour, and the specific quality of exhaustion that came not from the body, but from having something inside you break open. "I'm asking you about the rest of it." Serafina looked at him. "Adderley, Daub, Prigg." He held her gaze. "Prigg has been the administrative access point," she said, "which means anything that moved through the palace's document systems in the last 4 months. Any alteration, any misfiling, any letter that reached the council bearing a signature that might or might not be accurate. went through a man who had been given that access by this office, by this crown. She kept her voice level, not cold, not warm, the temperature of information being stated accurately. How long have you known him? 11 years. How long has Evelyn known him? The silence before his answer was the answer. Adrian. I introduced them, he said, 2 years ago, at the autumn review. He was managing the documentation for the Northern Territories trade adjustment, and she was there as part of her father's delegation. He said it with the flat delivery of a man reading damage inventory, each item placed down carefully. It didn't occur to me, that the woman you were beginning an arrangement with would identify the most useful person in the palace's administrative structure and spend 2 years building a relationship with him. Serafina breathed out through her nose. It should have occurred to you. I know that. It should have occurred to you because it's exactly what anyone with strategic intelligence and enough time would do. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. She came into this palace with a plan, Adrian. She didn't walk in on sentiment. She built a network, and she built it inside the infrastructure that we were both responsible for maintaining, and she used the access you gave her. Not directly, but through the doors you opened without examining what you were opening them for, to put the pieces in place. She stopped. Then, the coronation, next month, the wine service. Adrian's jaw tightened. Your daughter was going to be at that ceremony, Serafina said quietly. Cassia was going to be standing on the dais. Something moved through his face that was not about pain or medication or political consequence. Something rawer and more specific, the kind of thing that lives in a man below everything he's built on top of himself. His eyes went dark with it. I know, he said. His voice had changed. I know. They sat in the silence of that for a moment. The fire moved in the grate. Rain was still audible through the thick stone walls, diminished now, less violent. The storm was passing. Tell me what you signed, Serafina said. All of it. The actual language. So he told her. It took 40 minutes. She did not interrupt. She sat and listened to her husband describe, in the precise and slightly clinical language of a man trying to get through something difficult by treating it as administrative, the document he had executed 8 months ago in the private study of the hunting lodge, with Solon Prigg as one of 2 witnesses and a Northern Territories notary as the second. It was framed as a contingency instrument, a private dynastic provision to take effect only in the event of the Queen's death or formal incapacitation, establishing Evelyn Marrow as secondary consort with full legal standing to bear heirs whose succession rights would sit immediately behind those of Cassia. It was not, Adrian insisted, a replacement document. It was not, he said, intended as a removal mechanism. Serafina listened to all of it. She listened to the qualifications and the intentions and the explanations of what he'd meant versus what he'd put on paper. She listened to the language of a man who had told himself a story about his own actions that bore only partial resemblance to the actions themselves. When he finished, she said, You gave a woman with access to your palace and your administrative staff a legal instrument that could be used to challenge the succession of your children. And you stored that instrument with a man who has been feeding her information about the interior operations of this court for at minimum 4 months. She looked at him steadily. Whatever you intended, Adrian, that is what you did. He didn't argue. That, more than anything else tonight, told her something about where he actually was. The council convenes at dawn, she said, in approximately 4 hours. Before that session opens, I need to know the full scope of what Prigg has accessed and altered, and I need to know whether Adderley and Daub have document trails that will hold up under council review, or whether Evelyn built those into her contingency the same way she built everything else. She rose from the chair. I'm going to speak to Prigg now. Let me... He moved, and the movement pulled his shoulder, and he stopped, face going tight with it. No, she said, not harshly. You need to be functional at dawn. That's what you can do for this situation right now. Stay still and be functional at dawn. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him in a long time, possibly ever. Something between humiliation and the thing that lives on the other side of humiliation when a person stops protecting themselves from the full weight of what they've done. Serafina. She waited. I'm sorry, he said. Just that. No architecture around it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. I know you are. She moved toward the door. That's a starting point. It isn't a resolution. She stopped. Don't let Corin leave. I may need him before morning. She walked out. Solon Prigg was 51 years old, slight, with the scholar's habitual posture of a man who had spent 3 decades leaning over documents. He had thin gray hair and careful eyes, and the particular quality of personal presence that was, Serafina now understood, not quietness, but camouflage. He was sitting at the small table in the council chamber when she entered, with 2 of Reese's guard flanking the door, and Reese himself positioned near the window. Moss was in the corner with his ledger. Prigg looked up when she entered. He had been sitting with his hands flat on the table, which was what you did when you were deciding to perform cooperation. His face had arranged itself into the expression of a man who was going to say he didn't know what this was about. She sat across from him before he could speak. She placed 1 sheet of paper on the table between them, the page she'd been writing before all of this began, hours ago in her solar, when she'd had 40 minutes to prepare and had used them. He looked at the paper. He read it. His face did not change, but his breathing changed, and Serafina watched the breathing because she had learned years ago that breathing was the thing people couldn't fully manage when their face was working too hard on something else. The paper was a list, specific document references, filing dates, ledger codes, the particular bureaucratic notation of the palace's administrative archive system, 7 items. Each one an instance where a document passing through the deputy secretary's office had arrived at its destination in a form that varied, in specific and consequential ways, from the form in which it had originated. She had noticed these discrepancies over the past several months and had filed them, in the locked part of herself, as something requiring investigation that she hadn't yet had the bandwidth to pursue formally. She had not known what they meant. She knew now. The Thornfield Trade Amendment, she said, pointing to the 3rd item on the list. It left my desk with specific protective language for the southern wool producers. It arrived at the commission with that language absent. She tapped the paper. That happened in Prigg's office. He said nothing. The Callaway settlement terms, she said. The version the Northern Lords received included a provision that was not in the document I signed. A provision that, if the Northern Lords had accepted it in good faith, which 3 of them did, would have created a legal basis for challenging the settlement 6 months later. She looked at him directly. That version was generated in your office. His jaw moved. He was deciding something. I want to explain, he started. I want you to tell me, she said, cutting through it cleanly. How long? Not why. I'm not interested in why tonight. How long? The silence stretched. Outside, she could hear the rain had dropped to almost nothing. The storm was ending. 18 months, Prigg said. The number landed in the room and stayed there. 18 months. Not 4. Not the length of the hunting lodge arrangement. 18 months, which meant Evelyn Marrow had been building this before she was the acknowledged arrangement, before the document was signed, possibly before Adrian had even identified her as anything more than a Northern Lord's daughter at an autumn review. Serafina sat with that number and understood something she had not fully understood before tonight, which was that she had not been outmaneuvered by an opportunity. She had been outmaneuvered by a campaign. Someone, Evelyn Marrow, 26 years old with a Northern House's resources and enough intelligence to know that patience was the only weapon that worked against a woman who controlled her reactions, had looked at the architecture of the Valmont court and found the single structural weakness and built 18 months of work around exploiting it. And the weakness was not Adrian. The weakness was that Serafina had trusted the institution. She had trusted the palace's administrative machinery to function the way she'd designed it to function, because she had built so much of it, and because the alternative, to suspect every mechanism, every document, every person whose hands touched the paperwork of governance, was a form of paranoia that would have consumed the thing she was trying to protect. That trust was the weakness. Evelyn had found it. Prigg had been the instrument. The forged letters, Serafina said. Her voice was completely controlled, which was costing her something she couldn't currently quantify. Where are they? My secondary vault, Prigg said. He had made his decision, somewhere in the last 60 seconds. She could hear it in the texture of his voice. Not cooperation, not remorse, but the decision of a man who has calculated that the game is finished and disclosure is now the better arithmetic. All 3 copies. The original template and 2 execution copies. There's also a second document in that vault that you don't know about. Serafina held very still. Tell me. Evelyn had a second track, he said. Separate from the betrothal amendment. Separate from the letters. He was looking at the table now. There was a proposal, a formal one, drafted in the correct legal language, for a regency arrangement. In the event of the Queen's death during the coronation ceremony, before a new crown appointment could be ratified by council, the regency for Princess Cassia would default to the secondary consort. To Evelyn. He paused. That document is also in my vault. It was to be introduced to two council members, Adderley and Daub, the morning after the coronation, after you were gone. The fire in the grate was the only sound in the room for several seconds. Serafina looked at Prig and understood something about herself in that moment. Something that the past 18 months, if she'd known about them, might have revealed earlier. She had believed that the careful, rational, controlled approach was impenetrable, that the empire she administered with precision was proof against the specific kind of attack that came from passion, from ambition, from the human willingness to burn things down for the chance at something larger. She had been wrong, not about the approach, about the scope of its protection. Control protected you from chaos. It did not protect you from someone who was equally controlled, equally patient, equally willing to think 6 moves ahead, and who had less to lose. That was the thing Evelyn Marrow had understood from the beginning, and that Serafina was understanding now, in a council chamber at 2 in the morning with a wounded husband in the next room and her daughter's name in the middle of a document she hadn't known existed. Less to lose was not weakness. In certain configurations, it was the most dangerous kind of power there was. She rose. She looked at Reese. Adderley and Daub, tonight. She looked at Moss. Every word. She looked at Prig one last time, not with the fury she felt, which was real and large and sitting somewhere in her chest like a stone placed precisely on a structural point, but with the cold, complete attention of a woman who has just recalculated the entire scope of what she's facing. You were trusted, she said to him, not as accusation, as fact. By me and by this institution, for 9 years. She let that sit for one moment. Whatever comes next for you in terms of formal proceedings, understand that the record will show the full extent of what that trust was and what you did with it. Every document, every alteration, every meeting. She moved toward the door. The Empire has a long memory, Prig, longer than any of us. She walked into the corridor and stood there alone for exactly 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she now knew. The 18 months, the Regency document, the degree to which the ground beneath her had been prepared for her to fall through. And then she set it down. Not away, down. Where she could find it later, when there was time to process what it meant. When the immediate architecture of survival had been addressed, and the crisis had been reduced to the size where grief and fury could be given their proper space. Right now, there was no space. Right now, there was a council session in 4 hours, 3 corrupt nobles to be taken into custody, a vault that needed to be opened under formal witness, a king with a sutured shoulder who needed to be functional by dawn, and a daughter sleeping in the East Wing who did not yet know that her mother had spent this evening dismantling the mechanism designed to remove her from the succession, Cassia. 14. With Adrian's jaw and her mother's eyes, currently asleep in the East Wing with no knowledge of what this night had held, Serafina started walking toward the East Wing. She was not going to wake her daughter. She was going to stand outside Cassia's door for 60 seconds and listen to the quiet that meant the girl was safe and undisturbed, and then she was going to return to the administrative work of salvaging what remained of the Empire's integrity before dawn. That was all. 60 seconds of something that was not strategy and not governance and not the controlled management of a crisis. She was halfway down the corridor when Mary appeared from the cross passage ahead, and the specific quality of Marit's movement, fast, not running but close, stopped Serafina where she stood. What? She said. Marit reached her. Adderley, she said. Reese sent a man to bring him in. She stopped. He's gone. His quarters are empty. His personal correspondence is cleared out. The guard at the east gate says a carriage left through the servant passage approximately 90 minutes ago, shortly after Miss Marrow began speaking in the grand hall. Marit's face was doing the thing it did when the information was the worst version. He took Lord Daub with him. Serafina was silent. They were watching the banquet, Marit said. They would have heard everything. They had 90 minutes of warning before anyone moved to secure them. Serafina thought about the geometry of this. 2 senior council members. Men with resources, connections, the accumulated weight of their positions converted into the portable currency of flight, outside the capital, in the dark. With a 90-minute head start and the knowledge of everything that Evelyn had described in the grand hall, Witnesses who had run, not just corrupt nobles stripped of position and exiled, which was containable, which was the manageable version of this, but men who were now outside her reach, who carried in their heads, and possibly in their personal effects, the documentation of 18 months of coordinated subversion, and who had every incentive to reach a foreign court or a sympathetic northern house, and begin, from that position, the specific kind of secondary campaign that was waged not with blades but with letters and intermediaries, and the slow erosion of a crown's legitimacy from the outside. Serafina stood in this corridor and understood that the night was not over. Had not been over when she thought it was. Had not resolved at the point where she'd allowed herself to begin the mental calculation of what came next. Because what came next was larger than she'd thought, and the ground was different now than it had been an hour ago. She had been operating as though the crisis was interior, contained within the palace walls, manageable through the instruments of the court, the record, the council, the guard, the formal mechanisms she controlled. She had been wrong again. The crisis had legs now. It was moving in the dark outside the city, carrying names and documents and the specific knowledge of every point at which the court's defenses could be pressed from the outside. And she was standing in a corridor inside those defenses, with a wounded king and a sleeping daughter, and 4 hours until dawn, and the architecture she had spent 16 years building had just revealed the full scope of its compromised foundations. She had two choices. She had always had two choices, underneath everything, no matter how many variables the situation accumulated. She could manage this the way she had managed everything for 16 years, carefully, precisely, from within the structure, protecting the stability of the institution above all other considerations. Or she could recognize that the institution had been used as a weapon against her and act accordingly. The woman who had stood at that window watching fireworks 8 hours ago would have chosen the first. She was no longer certain that woman was sufficient for what the morning required. Serafina looked at Marit. She felt something shift in her chest. Not break, not collapse, but shift, the way load-bearing weight transfers when a structure reconfigures itself under pressure. Something that had been held in one position for 16 years moved into a different position. It was not comfortable. It was not clean. It was, she thought, possibly necessary. "Send ravens to the eastern border posts," she said. Her voice was different. She heard it herself. Still controlled, still precise, but carrying something underneath the precision that hadn't been there before. Something with edges. "Standard pursuit protocol. I want Adderley's description and Daub's in the hands of every gate authority within a day's ride of the capital, by dawn." She held Maret's eyes. "And I want you to bring me Lord Aurel, now, not the council room, my solar." "Aurel," Maret said carefully. "He's afraid of me," Serafina said. "He has been for years. Tonight he watched me handle this room, and he watched 2 of his colleagues run, and he is sitting somewhere in this palace, calculating whether the correct move is to attach himself to what I'm doing, or to start his own quiet correspondence with the men who just left through the east gate." She started walking. "I want him in my solar in 30 minutes. I want to have a conversation with him before he finishes that calculation." Maret fell into step beside her. "If Aurel runs too," Maret said, "then we'll know exactly what we're dealing with," Serafina said, "and we'll act accordingly." She said it without breaking stride, and the corridor carried her forward, and the palace settled around her in the last dark hour before dawn. The empire she had managed and protected and bled for, now requiring something from her it hadn't required before. Not her patience, not her precision, not the controlled, careful, institutional version of herself that had absorbed everything and kept functioning. Something older. Something that had been waiting, she realized, for the moment when all other options had been spent. She was almost to the solar when she heard Cassia's door, the east wing, 50 feet to her left, open quietly. And her daughter's voice, 14 years old and still carrying the particular quality of a child's sleepy confusion, mixed with the beginning instinct for adult alarm, said from the darkness of the corridor, "Mother?" Serafina stopped. She turned. Cassia was standing in her doorway in her nightclothes, hair down, eyes moving from her mother's face to the blood that was dried on Serafina's hands, where she'd held Adrian's wound closed and hadn't yet had the moment to wash it off. The girl's face went through 3 expressions in 4 seconds: confusion, fear, the specific recalibration of a young person absorbing that the world has done something tonight that she doesn't yet understand. "Are you hurt?" Cassia said. "No," Serafina said. "It isn't mine." Cassia looked at her mother. Really looked. The way children looked at parents when they were deciding whether the answer was the complete truth or the version of the truth that parents gave when they were protecting you from the full weight of something. She was 14 and she had her mother's eyes. And what those eyes did now was read the corridor, read the blood, read the specific quality of whatever was on Serafina's face, and arrive at a conclusion. Tell me what happened, Cassia said. Not asking. Not a child. Something else. The first edge of what she would become. Serafina looked at her daughter for one long moment in the pre-dawn dark, and made the decision that would change both of them. Serafina looked at her daughter for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of calculation that felt longer from the inside. Not because she was afraid of the truth, but because she understood that the truth, once given to Cassia, could not be taken back, and that what she placed in her daughter's hands tonight would become part of the architecture of whoever that girl became. She said, "Come with me." Not to the solar. She took Cassia to the small map room adjacent to the East Wing Library, a room that had no corridor access except through the library itself, whose walls were stone 4 feet thick, and whose single window faced an interior courtyard. A room where conversations did not leave. Serafina had used it exactly twice before for sensitive discussions, and both times the choice had been correct. She lit the lamp herself. She sat Cassia at the table and she stood across from her and she told her daughter what had happened that night. Not the version shaped for a child, not the version managed for the comfort of the listener, but the accurate version, delivered in plain language, the same way she would have delivered it to Maret or Reese. The banquet, Evelyn, the blade, the document Adrian had signed, Prig, the Regency provision, Cassia's name in the center of it, the specific mechanism that had been designed to use her as the legal bridge between her mother's removal and Evelyn Marrow's installation. Cassia sat through all of it without speaking. Her face went through the same 3-stage process Serafina had watched in the doorway. Confusion, fear, recalibration. But the recalibration ran deeper this time, ran all the way down to something that was not child and not adult, but the specific thing that existed in the space between them. The thing that formed when a person understood for the first time that the world could move against them deliberately, that intention and malice were different weights than accident and indifference, and that their own name had been written into someone else's plan without their knowledge. When Serafina finished, Cassia said, "Where is father?" "In the antechamber off the Grand Hall. He'll be there until morning." "He signed it." Not a question. "Yes." Cassia's jaw tightened exactly the way Adrian's did. "And he's the king," Serafina said. "And he is also your father, and he took a blade that was meant for me tonight. Both of those things are true, and both of them matter, and how much weight you give each one is something you'll be working out for years." She looked at her daughter directly. "What matters right now is that you know. Not because you need to do anything tonight, because you are the heir to this crown, and the heir to this crown does not get to be surprised by what lives inside its walls." Cassia was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" Serafina held very still for one beat. What she felt, sudden, sharp, located precisely behind the sternum, was not pride in the sentimental sense, but something harder and more structural. Recognition. The same feeling she'd had the first time she'd watched a diplomatic negotiation go exactly the way she'd designed it, and understood that the design had worked not by accident, but because she had actually understood the forces involved. Her daughter was asking the right question. "Stay in your rooms until I send Mara for you," she said. "If anyone other than Mara or Reese comes to your door before dawn, do not open it." She moved to the door. "And Cassia." She stopped. "When you go back to bed, if you can sleep, understand that tonight is not the shape of your inheritance. Tonight is what your inheritance is being protected from. There is a difference." Cassia looked at her with those gray eyes. "Are you sure?" "No," Serafina said, which was the truest thing she'd said in hours. "But I'm working on it." She left the map room and moved through the corridor at a pace that was just below a run, because running in the corridors of your own palace in the middle of a crisis was a signal to every person who saw you that the crisis had exceeded your capacity to manage it, and that signal was the one thing she could not afford tonight. Lord Oral was already in the solar when she arrived. This surprised her, and she allowed herself to register the surprise because it was useful data. It meant he hadn't needed 30 minutes to decide. He'd been waiting for the summons, which meant he'd already done the calculation and arrived at the answer before she asked the question. I was 61, and tonight he looked 70. He was sitting in the chair nearest the cold fireplace with his hands on his knees, and he rose when she entered with the formality of a man who had decided that formality was the correct posture for what was coming. "Your Majesty," he said. "Sit down," she said, pulling her own chair directly across from him, no desk between them. Mairead closed the door behind her and stationed herself near it. Aurel sat. He looked at her hands, the dried blood, which she still hadn't washed, which she had decided by this point to stop noticing until she had a moment to address it, and then at her face. "Adderley and Daub are gone," she said. "I know," he said. "You know because you were watching the exits," she said, "or because they told you." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. 61 years old, 20 years on the Royal Council, a man who had navigated 4 administrations by being impossible to fully pin down. He said, "They told me 2 weeks ago that if the situation in the banquet became unmanageable, they were leaving." The air in the room changed. Serafina did not move. "2 weeks ago. They approached me," Aurel said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something and is setting it down, not out of virtue, but out of the accurate calculation that the weight is no longer worth what it cost him. "They wanted me to be part of what they were arranging. A council block. 3 senior members prepared to ratify the betrothal amendment and the regency provision simultaneously, presenting the full council with a fait accompli." He folded his hands. "I said no." "Why?" she said. "Because I have watched you run this empire for 11 years, he said, "and I have disagreed with your methods and your pace and 2 of your trade policies, and the entire Callaway settlement, which I believe was structurally flawed from the beginning. And I have fought you in council 12 times and won 4 of those, and I'll take those 4 to my grave as some of the best work I've done." Something shifted in his face. "But you are the correct person to hold this crown, not by sentiment, by function. And what Adderley and Daub were proposing was not a political adjustment, it was an amputation." He stopped. "I said no. And I should have come to you immediately after, and I did not. And that is, I know what that is." Serafina sat with this information and processed it cleanly, the way she processed everything. Not emotionally first, but structurally first, and then emotionally in the leftover space. Aurel had known for 2 weeks. He had not acted against her. He had also not warned her. That was a specific shape of choice, neither treachery nor loyalty, but the gray territory that men like Aurel inhabited professionally, the zone of maintained options. She was going to need him. That was the practical reality of the next 6 hours. She was going to need a senior council voice who was not corrupt, not fleeing, and not fully aligned with the king's faction. Aurel was all 3 of those things. She was going to need to decide right now whether his 2-week silence was disqualifying. She decided it wasn't, not because she forgave it, she wouldn't use that word, but because the present required his function and the past was the past problem, and she had spent enough of tonight on the past. "At dawn," she said, "when the council convenes, I need a motion from a senior member to formally suspend the instrument." Adrian signed and to initiate a full review of all documentation processed through the Deputy Secretary's office in the past 18 months. She held his eyes. "I need it presented as council initiative, not as a royal directive. It needs to look like the institution correcting itself." "You need it to look like the council still works," Aurel said. "I need the council to still work," she said, looking like it is secondary. He was quiet for a moment. "Adderley and Daub will reach a sympathetic house within 3 days. They'll start correspondence. There are 3 or 4 northern lords who are already watching this situation, and who will take the opportunity to question the council's authority directly." He looked at her. "You understand what the next several months look like?" "I understand it clearly," she said. "It won't be clean." "It was never going to be clean." She stood. "Will you bring the motion?" Aurel looked at her for 1 long moment. 20 years on the council, 12 fights, 4 wins he'd take to his grave. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Get some rest. 2 hours if you can." She moved to the door. "And Aurel." She stopped without turning. "When this is over, when the immediate crisis is resolved and the council is functional and the succession is secured, I intend to have a complete accounting of every senior official who knew things they did not disclose to this crown, including the 2-week window." She paused. "Not tonight, but it will happen." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She left. The hours between 3 and dawn were the hours that nobody wrote about afterward, the operational hours, the grinding mechanical work of crisis management that lacked the drama of confrontation and the clarity of resolution. Serafina moved through them the way she moved through everything, systematically, completely, without allowing the accumulated weight of the night to migrate from the contained space where she'd put it into the working space she needed. Prigg's vault was opened at 3:40 in the morning under the joint witness of Moss, Reese, and two senior council members dragged from their beds. The contents were inventoried on the spot. The forged letters were there, 3 copies, as Prigg had described, in a sealed document case with Evelyn's personal mark pressed into the wax. The Regency provision was there. And there was a 4th document that Prigg had not mentioned, either because he'd forgotten it or because he'd made one final calculation about information management, which was a summary ledger in Solon Prigg's own handwriting, documenting 18 months of document alterations with dates, reference numbers, and in several cases the name of the person who had requested each alteration. It was, Serafina stood and understood as she read it, in the pale light of the vault's single lantern, either the insurance policy of a man who had never fully trusted the people he was working with, or the last act of a bureaucrat who had understood, somewhere in the back of his meticulous mind, that record-keeping was the only moral framework he had left, and he hadn't been able to entirely abandon it. Either way, it was comprehensive. It was devastating. It was exactly what the council review would need. She left Reese to manage the vault inventory and walked to the antechamber where Adrian was. He was awake. He looked like a man who had not slept and was not going to sleep, sitting upright on the recovery cot with his shoulder immobilized and his eyes carrying the particular exhausted alertness of someone who had been running worst-case scenarios in their own head for 3 hours. She stood in the doorway. Prigg's vault is open. We have the full documentation. She paused. It's enough. Something in his face released. Not relief. Too much had happened for relief to be clean. More like the particular dropping of a weight that had been held at maximum extension for a long time. Adderley and Daubron, she said. We've sent for them. Whether we get them back is a longer process. She looked at him steadily. At dawn, you are going to sit before the council in your full capacity as king, and you are going to support every motion that comes forward, not passively, actively. I need your voice in that room. You have it, he said. No qualification. After the session, she said, there will be a public statement. I have drafted it. You will read it. It will acknowledge the existence of the private instrument, characterize it accurately as an error of judgment, with potentially serious consequences for the succession, and announce the council's review. She paused. It will also acknowledge that the Crown's administrative integrity was compromised and that the process of repair has begun. Another pause. It will be in both our names. Adrian looked at her. Both. You are still the king, she said. The stability of the empire requires that to remain visibly true. If the crown fractures publicly, Adderley and Daub have everything they need to build an external challenge. She met his eyes. I am not protecting you. I am protecting the institution that I have spent 16 years building, which happens to include your position within it. He held her gaze. I know the difference, he said quietly. Good, she said. She was turning to leave when he said, Serafina. And something in the way he said it, not the formal 2 syllables of 16 years of public address, but the name as it had been said a long time ago, before the weight of the crown and the children and the campaigns and the accumulated distance between 2 people who had chosen function over feeling and paid the full price of that choice, made her stop. She waited. I know there is an aversion of an apology, he said, that is equal to the size of what I did. I'm not going to insult you by trying to construct one. He stopped. I want you to know that I understand what this has cost you, not just tonight, the whole of it. What it's cost you to run this empire from the position you've been given and to do it the way you've done it. His voice had gone rough at the edges. I have been careless with things that deserved care. I know what that is. Serafina stood at the door with her hand not quite on the frame and looked at her husband in the lamplight, and felt beneath the exhaustion and the fury and the administrative clarity and the dried blood on her hands that she still hadn't washed, felt something that she couldn't immediately categorize, something that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but some third thing that didn't have a clean name. She said, Get some rest. I need you functional at dawn. She walked out. The Raven came at 5:40 in the morning. She was in the solar, reviewing the council session agenda with Aurel when Maret brought it in, a sealed dispatch from the eastern border post at Garen's Cross, 40 miles from the capital, marked urgent in the postmaster's hand. She broke the seal and read it, and the solar went quiet around her in a way that Aurel, watching her face, understood immediately was a different quality of quiet than he'd been witnessing all night. She set the dispatch on the table. She looked at Aurel. She looked at Maret. Adderley and Dalby didn't go to a northern house, she said. Her voice was completely flat. They went to the border. She looked at the dispatch again. They crossed into Threnish territory at approximately 2 this morning. She paused. They were met at the crossing by a Threnish military escort, prearranged, with flags. Aurel went very still. The Threnish Empire sat on the northern and eastern borders of the Valmont realm, and had been, for 11 years, in a state of managed tension that Seraphina had administered through the trade negotiations she'd conducted personally, the agreements she'd signed, the careful relational work that had kept a potential war at the level of diplomatic friction rather than something worse. She knew the Threnish court. She knew their calculation. She knew that they had been watching the Valmont succession question for years, the way neighboring powers watched succession questions, with patient interest, waiting for the moment when the internal fracture was large enough to be useful. 2 senior Valmont council members, crossing the border with prearranged military escort, carrying documentation of an 18-month conspiracy to destabilize the crown and a forged letter set designed to implicate the Queen, walking directly into the arms of the empire that had the most to gain from the Valmont court tearing itself apart. This was not an escape. This was a delivery. Adderley and Daub had not run. They had completed the final phase of a plan that had been coordinating with Threnish interests from the beginning, possibly from before Evelyn Marrow's name had ever entered a single document. Evelyn had not been the architect. She had been the interior mechanism. The exterior one had just walked across the border under foreign military protection. Seraphina looked at the window. The sky outside had gone the gray-blue of the hour before dawn. Not dark anymore. Not light yet. The specific, indeterminate color of the world, holding its breath before it committed to a new day. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she had. She thought about a 14-year-old girl sleeping in the East Wing with gray eyes that read corridors, and a king with a sutured shoulder who had stood in front of a blade, and an empire she had built from the inside out for 16 years that was now facing a threat that her 16 years of careful, institutional, controlled governance had not been designed to address. Because this, what she was looking at now, was not a court crisis. It was not an administrative failure. It was not even a conspiracy. It was an act of foreign preparation, a state of readiness that had been assembled outside her walls while she managed the interior, and it had been waiting for exactly the kind of internal fracture that had occurred tonight to give it the opening it needed. Patient, controlled, willing to wait years for the correct moment. She recognized the methodology because it was her own. Someone had been studying her. Someone had understood exactly how Seraphina Valmont operated and had built a counter-architecture around that understanding and waited for the night when she would be too occupied managing the interior crisis to see the exterior one assembling on her border. She felt something cold move through her. Not fear. Something more specific. The recognition of a mind that had been working in parallel to hers, at the same resolution, with more time and more patience, and none of the constraints that came from governing rather than merely planning. She was not used to recognizing an equal from a position of disadvantage. She stood up. How many troops does Thren currently have positioned within 50 miles of Garen's Cross? She said. Not to Aurel specifically. To the room, to the question, to the night that was about to become a morning, that was about to become something she did not yet have a complete name for. Aurel was already at the wall map. The spring deployment data puts 3 Threnish infantry divisions in the Garen corridor. He traced the line with one finger. Plus the river guard at Aldenmere. That's not an escort arrangement. That's if they moved on the crossing. They won't move tonight, Seraphina said. They're not ready to move. They needed the documents and the witnesses first. They need to build the case before the other border powers before they move. She was already at her writing desk, which means we have days. Not many, but days. She pulled a sheet of paper and uncapped her pen. Who do we have at Garen's Cross? She said. Commander Vess, Aurel said. She's held that posting for 3 years. Solid officer. Limited resources. It's a peacetime garrison. Send to Vess, Seraphina said, writing. Full garrison to defensive posture. No engagement, no provocation, but she closes the crossing and she lets nothing else through in either direction. She wrote for 30 seconds, fast, without pausing. I also need a writer to the Southern Military District. General Aldrich, not the event Aldrich, the general, needs to know that the situation has a foreign component and that I want the two nearest divisions on 48-hour readiness. She kept writing. And I want the Threnish ambassador. He was at the banquet tonight. I watched him leave. He's still in the palace's diplomatic wing. I want him in the council chamber at dawn, not after the session, at the session, present. Aurel turned from the map. You want the Threnish ambassador in the council session. I want him to watch, she said. I want him to sit in that room and watch the Council of Valmont conduct a full, formal, transparent accounting of the night's events and come out of it intact. I want him to write back to his sovereign that he sat in that chamber at dawn and watched this crown function. She set the pen down. Because the Threnish calculation is built on the premise that we are breaking. I want to change the premise. She sealed the dispatches. She looked at Marais. These go by the fastest riders we have. Yes, ma'am. The door opened and Reese entered, coat still damp from hours ago, jaw set, the specific face of a man who had been managing crisis logistics for 6 hours on no sleep, and was operating on something that lived below conscious will. The council members are assembling, he said. 40 minutes. Adrian, she said, have Corin clear him to attend. He'll insist on attending regardless. I know. Have Corin clear him anyway, so it's not a point of argument. She moved to the window. The sky was lightening. The city below the palace walls was beginning to move. She could see the early market carts on the boulevard, the first smoke from bakery chimneys, the particular quality of a city that did not yet know what had happened inside its walls last night and would by nightfall know everything. And I need the public statement drafted before the session ends. It needs to go to the broadsheet editors by mid-morning. You want it in the morning editions, Aurel said. I want Valmont City to read it in our words before they hear it in someone else's, she said. She stood at the window and watched the dawn come in over the river and over the city and over the question of what the next 24 hours would require of her. The storm was completely gone. The sky was coming up clear and pale and cold, the kind of morning that arrived after violence and offered nothing by way of comfort, only light. She thought about Atterley and Daub on the Threnish side of the border, carrying their documents and their witness testimony and their knowledge of every crack in the palace's foundation. She thought about the patient intelligence that had been running a parallel game for longer than 18 months, possibly years, possibly since before Evelyn Marrow had walked into her first autumn review. She thought about the kind of mind that studied a queen's methodology and built a counter-architecture designed to use her own tools against her. She thought, if you want to beat a mind like that, you have to become something it didn't study. She had been, for 16 years, the queen who controlled the interior, the woman who managed the court, stabilized the administration, held the institution together with both hands and both eyes, and the full weight of her considerable capability, operating within the structure and through the structure and always in service of the structure. That version of her had been anticipated, had been mapped, had been accounted for in someone's long-term planning. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass of the window, the same gesture she'd made 8 hours ago watching fireworks, and understood that she was standing at the edge of a choice that was not reversible and not small. She could stay inside the structure, do what she was doing, the councils, the dispatches, the formal proceedings, the institutional mechanisms of a crown managing its own crisis. And she would manage it. She was very good at managing things. Or she could step outside the structure. Use the thing she'd kept locked, the part of herself that wasn't patient or careful or institutional, the part that had watched Evelyn Marrow walk into that banquet and felt something older than strategy move through her chest. She could take the empire she'd been managing as an administrator and run it the way the situation actually required, not through the council, not through procedure, not through the careful architecture of a woman who had learned that control was her survival, through force of will, through speed, through the willingness to do things the patient, careful, institutional version of herself would never have done. Behind her, Reese said, Your Majesty, it's time. She looked at the city. The light was coming up over the rooftops. 40 miles east at Garen's Cross, 3 Threnish infantry divisions were at the border. She turned from the window. Her face was different, Aurel saw it and looked away and then looked back because he was a man who had watched power operate for 20 years. And he knew, in the instinctive way you knew when weather was about to change, that what he was looking at was not the same thing that had been standing at that window 10 seconds ago. Marit saw it and straightened almost imperceptibly. Rhys saw it and his hand moved without any instruction to the hilt of his weapon, not in threat, not in aggression, but in the readiness of a soldier who recognizes that the engagement parameters have just changed. Serafina walked to the door. "Tell me," she said to Rhys as she moved into the corridor, and her voice was the voice of a woman who has made the irreversible decision and will live in its consequences with full awareness and zero regret. "What we have between here and that border, between the capital and Garen's Cross." There were 40 miles of post road, 2 garrison checkpoints, 1 river crossing at Aldenmere that Threnish forces had not yet moved to take, and approximately 900 Valmont soldiers distributed across the eastern corridor in the peacetime configuration that Serafina had designed 3 years ago for deterrence rather than engagement. Rhys told her all of this walking down the corridor toward the council chamber, and she listened and filed each number and each position the way she'd been filing information all night, not into the locked part, not into the working part, but into a third space that had opened up somewhere in the last 20 minutes. A space that was neither the careful administrator nor the cold strategist, but something that moved faster than both, and had fewer restrictions on what it was willing to consider. "The 900, she said. "What's their readiness?" "Standard peacetime, 48 hours to full deployment posture." He paused. "But Vess at Garen's Cross is a different calculation. She's been running that garrison on a shoestring for 3 years, and she knows that terrain better than anyone in the Eastern Command. If you need someone to hold a crossing for 72 hours on limited resources, she is the correct person. Get word to Vess before the council session opens," she said. "Not written orders. A rider with my personal authorization and verbal instructions. I want her to understand the full picture, not just a defensive directive." She looked at Rhys. "She needs to know what Adderley and Daub are carrying and what it's worth to the Threnish court. She needs to understand that holding that crossing is not a military exercise, it's a political one." Rhys nodded and broke away from her stride to find his messenger. She walked into the council chamber. The room was lit by 10 wall lamps and the gray light of early morning through the east windows, and it smelled of candle wax and old wood and the particular tension of people who had been woken from their beds and were sitting with incomplete information in a room they associated with formal proceedings, trying to determine what version of this morning they were actually in. 8 council members present. 2 chairs empty where Adderley and Daub had sat for years. The Threnish ambassador, Lord Fenwick, at a secondary position along the wall. He had come without protest, which told her everything about what he'd been expecting since the banquet and had prepared for. Adrian came in 2 minutes after her. His arm was in a sling and his color was not good, and he moved carefully, but he was upright, and his face had the quality she'd asked for. Present, functioning, the face of a king attending to the business of his kingdom on a difficult morning. He took his seat at the head of the table. He did not look at the Threnish ambassador. He looked at Serafina. She gave him the smallest nod. He straightened. Aurel brought the motion within the first 10 minutes, as agreed. The formal suspension of the private instrument, the full council review, the documentation from Prigg's vault submitted as evidence. It moved through the procedural steps with the mechanical reliability of an institution working correctly. And Serafina watched each vote and each recorded affirmation, and understood that what she was watching was not just governance but signal. Every vote in that room was a message to the man sitting along the wall with the Threnish crest on his coat. When the motion carried, she turned to Lord Fenwick. "Your Grace," she said, and the room went quiet. "The Valmont Council has this morning formally resolved the constitutional matter arising from last night's events. The record is complete and will be transmitted to all allied courts by the end of this week." She held his gaze with the specific steadiness of a woman who has not slept and does not intend that fact to be visible. "I want to extend to the Threnish court the same transparency. A full copy of the proceedings will be made available to your diplomatic office before noon." Fenwick was a careful man in his 50s with a diplomat's practiced face. "The Threnish court is grateful for the Queen's consideration," he said. "I also want you to convey to your sovereign," she said, "that the Valmont crown is aware of the arrangements made at Garen's Cross last night. The individuals involved have been formally charged under the council's authority. Their testimony will be subject to Valmont jurisdiction regardless of their current location. She paused one beat. And that the Eastern Corridor's defensive posture has been adjusted accordingly. The room was very quiet. Fenwick met her eyes. Whatever calculation was running behind his was a fast one, and she could see it finishing. He said, "I will convey Her Majesty's message." "Thank you," she said. The session ran for 2 more hours. By the time it concluded, the sky outside had gone fully light, and the palace was moving with the controlled urgency of an institution that had absorbed a shock and was processing it through its proper channels. Serafina signed 6 documents, amended 2, rejected 1 outright, and told the minister who'd presented it to rework the language and come back in the afternoon. She reviewed the public statement she'd drafted and made 3 changes. 1 word, 1 sentence, 1 entire paragraph that she cut because it explained too much. And things that explained too much were things that had already decided how they would be read. She sent for Cassia at 9 in the morning. Her daughter arrived in the council antechamber looking like a person who had not slept but had spent the sleepless hours doing something more purposeful than lying in the dark. She had dressed formally, not in court clothes, but in the structured riding clothes she wore for official inspections, which was a choice that Serafina registered and appreciated without commenting on. Cassia sat across from her at the small table and folded her hands and waited. "The council session is concluded," Serafina said. "The instrument your father signed has been suspended and placed under formal review. Eveline Marrow is in detention pending a full tribunal." She paused. "Adderley and Daub are on the Threnish side of the border with documents they intend to use against this crown. That is an ongoing situation, and it will remain ongoing for some time." "What are you doing about the border?" Cassia said. "Everything available to me," Serafina said, "which is a reasonable amount." Cassia was quiet for a moment. Then, "You told me last night that tonight wasn't the shape of my inheritance." She looked at her mother with those gray eyes that had been reading rooms since she was 8 years old. "I've been thinking about that." A pause. "What is the shape of it?" Serafina looked at her daughter and understood that the answer she gave to this question would be one of the ones that mattered. Not because Cassia would remember the words precisely, people rarely remembered words precisely, but because she would remember the quality of the truth in them, the specific texture of whether the person speaking had actually meant it or was constructing something protective. She said, "The shape of it is this. You will inherit a crown that was held together at a critical moment, not by force or by brilliance alone, but by the willingness of the people responsible for it to keep functioning. When functioning was the hardest possible thing." She stopped. "You will also inherit the debt of every mistake made by the people who came before you. Your father's. Mine. The things we did wrong and the things we did right and the things we did for reasons that seemed correct at the time and turned out to be insufficient." She met Cassia's eyes. "The shape of your inheritance is not power. Power is the instrument. The shape is responsibility. They are not the same thing, and the empires that forget the difference are the empires that end." Cassia sat with this. She had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and she was 14 and she was going to be, Serafina thought, something that neither of them had been individually. She was going to be both of them, the force and the precision, and the empire would be different for it. Better for it, if she was lucky, if they got the next several years right. "Okay," Cassia said, not as dismissal, as intake, filing it where it needed to go. "Go eat something," Serafina said. "I'll send for you this afternoon." She found Adrian in the East Garden at midday. He had gone there, apparently, while she was in the morning secondary meetings, walked out of the palace without his guard detail, which Rhys had told her with the face of a man who had decided this was not the hill he was going to die on, into the walled garden that had been the Queen's formal garden for 3 generations, but that nobody used in any serious way because it was cold for 7 months of the year, and the rest of the year it was usually raining. Today it was cold and clear, and the storm had left the garden scrubbed, the gravel paths dark with absorbed water, the hedgerows ragged, small branches brought down by the wind lying across the beds. Adrian was sitting on the stone bench near the central fountain, which was not running because it never ran before the spring ceremony, his good arm on his knee and his wounded arm in its sling across his chest, his face turned up toward the sun with his eyes closed. He heard her footsteps on the gravel and opened his eyes. She sat beside him on the bench, not close, not distant. The appropriate distance for two people who had shared a bed and a crown, and two buried children and 16 years in one very long night, and who were somewhere in the process of determining what they were to each other on the other side of all of it. They sat for a while without speaking. The garden was quiet in the way that spaces were quiet after storms. Not empty, but cleared, the air stripped of its usual accumulation and not yet refilled. Adrian said, "How bad is the Eastern situation?" "Manageable," she said. "Barely, but genuinely." She looked at the fountain. "Fenwick will go back and report that this court is functional and the council is unified and the crown is not broken. That changes the Threnish calculation significantly. They were waiting for a collapse, and what they saw this morning was a correction." She paused. "It won't end the pressure, but it changes the timeline." "And Adderley. We'll get him back," she said. "Not quickly. It'll be an extradition process, and the Threnish will delay it as long as they legally can. But the documentation from Prigg's vault is comprehensive enough that the tribunal doesn't actually need Adderley present to proceed." She paused. "Daub is more complicated. His family has Threnish connections that predate my time in this court. That may take a year." "A year," he said. "Governance is mostly years," she said. He muttered a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space. He was looking at the fountain, or past it, at something she couldn't see from where she was sitting. The sling made him look diminished in a way that the formal coat and the presence usually didn't allow for. Just a man in his early 40s with a wound in his shoulder and the specific tired quality of someone who has looked directly at the consequences of their own choices and not been able to look away. She thought about what it cost, that looking. She had always thought that the hardest thing was to build something, to construct the architecture of a functional life and a functional empire from the available materials, to hold it together when it wanted to come apart. But sitting here in the stripped clean morning, she understood that there was another hard thing, a different one, which was to sit in the ruins of what you'd damaged yourself and not cover it over, not reach for the convenient narrative that made it someone else's fault or an understandable mistake given the circumstances. To hold the weight of your own choices without putting them down. Adrian was holding his. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the specific quality of his silence. She said, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her. "I have spent 16 years managing the distance between us," she said, "making it functional, making it work for the empire, for Cassia, for the institution of this marriage as a political structure." She kept her eyes on the fountain. "I made the choice to do that. I didn't consult you about it. I decided that the management was the correct approach, and I executed it, and I am not going to apologize for that decision because, given what I knew and what the situation required, it was correct." She paused. "But I want to acknowledge that I did it, that I was a participant in the distance, that I chose function over other things." She stopped. Then, "I'm not saying that to excuse what you did. I'm saying it because the accurate account matters, and the accurate account includes my part in it." Adrian was quiet for a long time, long enough that a bird landed on the fountain rim and then left, and the sound of the city beyond the garden walls moved through one complete cycle of its ordinary noise. "I don't know how to be what this marriage needs me to be," he said finally. "I've known that for a long time, and I handled knowing it very badly." He looked at his hands. "I understand that understanding it doesn't change what I did." "No," she said, "it doesn't. But it's the beginning of something," he said. Not a question. She sat with that. The beginning of something was a careful, exact phrase for a man who usually dealt in larger and less careful expressions, and she recognized the precision in it and understood that it had cost him something to get there. "It might be," she said, "if you mean it as a direction rather than an arrival." "I mean it as a direction," he said. She nodded. She looked at the winter sky over the garden wall, pale and clean and enormous in the way that skies were after storms, temporarily expanded, all the accumulated weight of the weather moved through and gone, leaving a clarity that wouldn't last but was real while it lasted. She thought about Evelyn Marrow in the detention cell, and the amber dress, and the intelligence of the plan that had very nearly worked. She thought about what it meant that a 26-year-old woman with a northern house and a patient mind had gotten further than anyone before her in dismantling what Serafina had built, and she thought about whether that assessment contained a lesson or just a fact. She thought it contained both. She thought about Prigg's ledger, the 18 months of careful alterations, the meticulous record-keeping that had ultimately served her rather than destroyed her. the inadvertent honesty of a bureaucrat who hadn't been able to fully extinguish his own nature even in service of someone else's agenda. She thought about what it meant that the thing which saved the crown in the end was not her strategy or her control or her precision, but a man's inability to stop keeping accurate records even when accuracy was dangerous. The systems you built carried values you embedded in them. Those values persisted even when the people working the systems were working against you. That was either the most hopeful thing she knew or the most unsettling, and she hadn't decided which. "I need to go back inside," she said. "There's a second meeting with the trade commissioners this afternoon, and I have correspondence to write before the public statement goes out." "I know," he said. She stood. She looked down at him on the bench, this man who was the king and her husband and the father of her daughter, and the person who had stood in front of a blade when he didn't have to, and who had signed a document he should never have signed, and who had spent 14 years being careless with things that deserved care, and was now, for the first time she could clearly see, sitting in the full presence of what that carelessness had built. All of it true, simultaneously. All of it him. She put her hand on his good shoulder. Not the romantic gesture, not the managed public gesture. The gesture of two people who had been through the same storm and come out the other side of it changed, and were standing in the changed place together, not yet knowing what they would build there, but knowing the ground was real. He put his hand over hers. She left it there for 3 seconds. Then she took it back and walked toward the palace. The public statement went out at 2 in the afternoon. By 4, every broadsheet in Valmont City had it. By evening, writers had carried it to 12 provincial capitals. By the following morning, the diplomatic post had it in the hands of every allied court that mattered. Serafina read the printed version of it once, standing in her solar with the afternoon light coming through the window, and found 3 things she would have changed, and 1 sentence she was genuinely satisfied with. The 1 sentence was the one that said, "The Crown of Valmont has faced, in this period, a test of its essential character, and has chosen transparency and the rule of its own founding law over the convenience of concealment. This was a choice, and it was the correct one, and it will remain correct regardless of what it costs." She had written that sentence at 5 in the morning by lamplight with dried blood on her hands, and it had not changed in the 6 drafts since, which told her it was true. The weeks that followed were not clean. They were not the cinematic version of Aftermath. The neat resolution, the restored order, the clear demarcation between before and after. They were the actual version, which was administrative and grinding and full of the specific tedium of repair work. The tribunal proceedings that took 3 months and involved 900 pages of documentation from Prigg's vault. The extradition process for Adderley that moved through diplomatic channels with the frustrating slowness of things managed by people who benefited from slowness. The eastern border negotiations that Serafina conducted personally over 6 weeks of correspondence and 2 direct diplomatic sessions with the Threnish court that were the most technically demanding work she'd done in her career. She did not go to those sessions alone. She took Adrian, not because she needed him for the negotiations. She was, as she had always been, the better technical mind for that work, but because the message that needed to be delivered to the Threnish court was not technical. It was symbolic, in the exact sense that symbols carried real weight in the political calculations of neighboring empires, the crown of Valmont, king and queen, presenting a unified position at the table, using the same language and the same framing and the same willingness to hold the line. 2 people who had been nearly destroyed from the inside and had come through it and were still, visibly, the crown. The Threnish envoy at the final session, a woman named Cassar, who was precise and intelligent and had been watching the Valmont situation for years, said at the end of the second day's negotiations, "You are more difficult to deal with than your reputation suggested." Serafina said, "Our reputation was built on a period when we were easier to deal with." Cassar looked at her for a moment and then said, "The treaty terms are acceptable." Adrian, sitting to her left, did not say anything. He didn't need to. He had learned, in those 6 weeks, when his presence was the contribution and when speech would reduce it. That was not a small thing. She knew how much it had cost him, and she did not pretend it hadn't, and she did not thank him for it either, because the cost of a thing was not the same as a gift, and conflating them was a particular form of condescension she refused to perform. She acknowledged it by continuing to work alongside him. That was what she had. Evelyn Marrow's tribunal concluded on a cold morning in early winter. The charges were treason, conspiracy to commit the murder of a reigning queen, and forgery of royal instruments. The evidence was complete. The verdict was not in question. Serafina did not attend the reading of the judgment because her presence would have made it something other than what it needed to be. A legal proceeding, conducted by the institution, not a personal settling of accounts. She heard the verdict from Moss afterward, in the same council chamber where most of this had been determined. Life imprisonment at the Crown's discretion, commutable only by royal pardon. The Northern Territories, she said, Lord Casimiro. He has submitted a formal petition, Moss said carefully, on behalf of his house. He had a daughter with intelligence and ambition and no legitimate outlet for either, Serafina said. That's a governance failure as much as a personal one. She looked at the wall. File the petition. I'll review it in the spring. Moss made a note. She thought about Evelyn Marrow the way you thought about things that had tried to unmake you. Not constantly, not obsessively, but periodically, in the way that a person's mind returned to the specific shape of a danger once it was past, trying to extract what could be learned from it. What she extracted, over the months, was this. Evelyn had not been wrong about the weakness she identified. She had been wrong about what the weakness meant. She had looked at the distance between Adrian and Serafina and seen a fracture that could be widened into collapse. What she hadn't understood was that the distance was not the structure's fault line. The distance was the structure's working condition, its long-term operational state, not a crack but a space that both of them had chosen, consciously or not, because they hadn't yet found the thing that would close it. The closing of it, when it came, did not announce itself. It happened in the incremental way that real changes happened. Not in the dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of smaller ones. In Adrian staying at the table for the 5th straight hour of negotiation without suggesting they break. In Serafina explaining, once, why she'd made a specific council decision and watching him listen completely rather than waiting for his turn to speak. In Cassia, one evening at a family dinner that was neither formal nor performative, saying something sharp and accurate about a provincial lord's territorial petition, and both of them looking at their daughter at the same moment and then, briefly, at each other. It was not romantic in the way that a younger version of either of them might have required. It was something more durable and more honest than romance. The recognition between two people who had looked at each other's worst and had not left. That the staying itself was a form of declaration. Not passionate, not transcendent, real. On the first anniversary of the storm, the night of the Jubilee, the fireworks, the amber dress, the blade. Serafina stood on the east wing balcony in the late evening and watched the current year's fireworks go up over the river. She was alone. She had asked to be alone, which was a thing she allowed herself occasionally now in a way she hadn't before. The permission to need something purely for her own use rather than in service of function. The fireworks were the same as they always were. The gold, the red, the white sequence that Adrian kept wanting to cut, which was still there because she hadn't cut it, because she had reviewed the celebration program this year and left the white sequence in place on the specific grounds that she liked it, and that was sufficient reason. She had not told Adrian she'd done this. He would notice eventually. She was curious what he would say when he did. Below the palace, the city was its ordinary Jubilee self. Loud, crowded, the boulevard packed all the way to the harbor. Valmont City on a celebration night had a specific quality she had never been fully able to describe to anyone who hadn't stood in it. Something between danger and joy, the energy of a large number of people sharing a sky for an hour and forgetting whatever divided them. She thought about this woman she'd been on this balcony a year ago, or not on this balcony, at the solar window, pressing her fingers to the cold glass, watching the same fireworks with Merritt's information in her chest, and the locked part of herself running calculations, and the working part preparing for what would be required. That woman had been correct about almost everything. She had understood the situation with clarity and responded with precision and had done, for the most part, what the situation required. What she hadn't understood, that night a year ago, was the scope of what the situation would require over the months that followed. The ways it would demand not just her control, but her willingness to relinquish parts of the control, to let the institution carry weight she'd been carrying herself, to trust Orel and Reese and Moss, and even Adrian with pieces of the load she'd been holding alone for 16 years. To understand that the strength that had kept the empire together wasn't located entirely in her. It was distributed, dispersed, embedded in the systems and the people she'd built and trained and tested, and she could let it do its work. That was the thing she would have said to the woman at the window a year ago if she could have reached back through the night and the fireworks and the storm that was coming. not be stronger, not be smarter, not be more prepared. Let it be distributed. The empire does not live only in you. A burst of gold went up over the river, and the crowd's exhale reached her even up here, that wave-breaking sound. She watched the light come down. Behind her, the balcony door opened. She didn't turn. She knew the footstep. Adrian came to stand beside her. His shoulder had healed. Not perfectly. The arm rotation was still slightly limited, would probably always be. But the sling was long gone, and he stood straight in his informal coat with his hands on the balcony railing and his face turned up toward the last of the gold light fading. He said, "You left the white sequence in." "I did." "I noticed." "I know," she said. A pause. The fireworks went quiet for a moment between volleys, that brief held interval before the next sequence. "Below?" the crowd murmured. "Serafina," he said. She waited. "Thank you," he said. "For not—" He stopped. "For what you chose. After." She looked at the river. The way the reflection of the fireworks came apart on the moving water, broke into pieces that were somehow brighter individually than the whole had been, scattered across the dark surface in fragments of gold. "I didn't choose it for you," she said. "I want you to understand that. I chose it for the Empire and for Cassia, and because it was the correct decision given the variables." A pause. "But I also chose it because you stepped in front of that blade, and those two things can both be true." He said nothing. She could feel him standing beside her with the weight of everything the year had made him, and it was a different weight than the man who'd walked into the banquet 14 months ago. Heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The weight of someone who had put down the specific armor of carelessness and had not yet fully decided what to wear instead. She thought he would figure it out. She thought he already was. The final volley went up over the river. The big one, the third act, all the shells at once in the massive, simultaneous burst that ended every jubilee and that Adrian thought dragged but that she had always found, privately, to be the truest moment of the whole display. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Because it was the moment when everything that had been built up over the long, careful preceding sequence was finally released all at once, and the sky held it all for 3 seconds before it started to come down. And in those 3 seconds it was just light, complete and total, no strategy in it, no architecture, just the full expenditure of everything that had been stored and saved and prepared. She breathed it in. The light came down. The crowd below cheered. The river carried the reflection apart. Serafina stood on the balcony of the palace she had defended with both hands and a considerable part of herself. In the clear night that followed the worst storm the Empire had weathered in her tenure, beside the man she had chosen to continue with, and she felt the specific, unglamorous, entirely adequate weight of a life that had not been destroyed, that had been tested to the edge of its load-bearing capacity and had held, not cleanly, not without cost, not in the way that the stories told afterward would describe, because the stories always needed the version that was cleaner than the truth, but held. The Empire was not the same as it had been a year ago. She was not the same. Adrian was not. Even Cassia, who had spent the year watching her parents work and argue and negotiate and occasionally, in the map room where Serafina had taken to meeting with her twice a week, sit together in silence over the same documents and reach different conclusions and have the argument about the conclusions out loud. Cassia was not the same. She was becoming the thing that Serafina hadn't been able to fully see a year ago, the next version. The one that would take what had been built and damaged and repaired and make it into something neither of them had anticipated. That was what survived, in the end. Not the edifice, the capacity to rebuild it. Not the unbroken surface, but the knowledge of how to work the fractures, how to turn them from catastrophe to structure, how to make the place where the thing had cracked into the place where it was now strongest. Serafina Valmont had not been remembered as a betrayed wife. She had not set out to be remembered as anything. She had set out, on a stormy night 14 months ago, to do what the situation required of her. And then she had done it again the next morning, and the morning after that, and every difficult morning since, in the grinding, unglamorous way that real work was done. That was the whole of it. That was what she knew. The fireworks were finished. The crowd below was dispersing, the long, slow tide of the celebration pulling back toward the city's ordinary life. The river carried the last of the light away. Serafina stood in the clear night and breathed. It was enough.